Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 10th Ferngespräch, the German word for long-distance call. After having traveled to Lebanon, to Iran, to several Kurdish regions, to Afghanistan, to Tunisia, Morocco, Israel, Sudan, and Kuwait, we will focus our attention today on Palestine and the Palestinian diaspora. More precisely on the situation of Palestinian refugees and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, better known as UNRWA, who, according to its own sources, provides assistance and protection for some 5.6 million Palestinian refugees. My name is Christoph Dinkelacker. I'll be moderating tonight, and I am active in the two hosting organizations of this event. One of them I will introduce now. One of them is called Alsharq. Alsharq travels nowadays. It is an organization that offers political study tours, mainly to Western Asia and Northern Africa, but by now also to other destinations beyond, with a focus on political encounters and in general encounters with activists, journalists, academics, anyone who has something interesting to say in the respective countries. And our aim is to listen a lot and to discuss and to get to know countries in a more comprehensive way. And because of Corona, we had not been able to travel for the last 9 months, and our core work has been somehow out of place. So nowadays we do offer a lot of digital events and digital conferences, digital travels, and my colleagues who do the technical stuff in the back will provide you in the chat function with more infos on what we nowadays do. The second organization that is hosting this event is called Orient. I'm also part of that group. But my dear colleague, Magda, who is also very close to today's project, will introduce you to Orient. The floor is yours, Magda.
Okay, so I think now it works. So good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of Orient, the second hosting organization this evening, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's event. Yes, my name is Magdalena Süß, and I am board member of the nonprofit organization Orient, which is a platform for young journalists, academics, and activists with a focus on West Asia and North Africa. And inspired by feminist and post-colonial thoughts, we try to tackle Orientalist discourses and work on the multiple entanglements between Germany and/or Europe and our focus region, West Asia and North Africa. So together, Orient runs an online magazine, but we also organize events, discussion rounds, workshops, and exhibitions on various topics. Currently, we are, for example, planning an exhibition which will look at Berlin as a place of exile and homemaking. And in this regard, I would like to share an open call for artists with you. We invite submissions from locally based artists who deal with the topics of exile, diaspora, and political spaces for migrants in Berlin. The deadline is on Sunday, and I will also share the link with more information with you in the chat function. And so please feel free to share it just with your networks and whomever, could be interested. And of course, in case you want to support us, or if you want to become an active member of Orient, just contact us. And now I would like to hand over back to my colleagues in Berlin and wish you a very inspiring event.
Thank you very much, Magda, and thank you for sharing, especially our current event on exile and diaspora, which very much links to today's topic. We'll be talking about the situation of Palestinian refugees, the history, also the legal situation, but also the de facto situations in the different places where Palestinian refugees live, be it in Palestine and be it abroad, be it in refugee camps, be it in other places of diaspora. Second, we'll be talking about the challenges the main United Nations organization, UNRWA, with regards to Palestinian refugees is dealing with. So let's have a look at the program of today. We'll be starting in a second with an input by, I could say, UNRWA veteran, former chief of ethics, Lex Takkenberg, about the history, the legal and the de facto situation of Palestinian refugees. He has provided us with a presentation that he will show, and followed by his presentation, Palestinian researcher Rania Muhareb will comment on what Lex was reflecting on. And after that, you always have the chance to send in questions at any time. So there will be always space for Q&A, and please use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar on the one hand for that. On the other hand, you can also send us questions via the Facebook comments. So as we're also streaming this on Facebook Live. So this is the first part. Second part is going to be done by my dear friend and colleague Georg Weininger, a political scientist from Germany, specialized on international organizations and human rights. And he will introduce us to UNRWA with a focus on current challenges. And Georg is also the one, I must say, who has brought all these distinguished speakers together. And I would like to say thank you so much, Georg, at this moment for making this event actually possible. And last but definitely not least, Francesca Albanese, who is a co-author of the pioneering book Palestinian Refugees in International Law, will present the key findings of this second edition of this standard book on the situation of Palestinian refugees in international law, and she will share her policy recommendations. Francesca Albanese is an international lawyer, legal researcher, and as I said, co-author of this book. As always, Rania will follow up with comments from a Palestinian perspective, and there will be space for Q&A as well. And in the end, we'll be having some closing remarks, an outlook on upcoming events as well. And that's it for now. Now, before I hand over to Lex, one last thing. We are, as Orient, as Alsharq, doing these events for free. We, at the time when we have really great financial difficulties due to Corona, we can't do political study tours whatsoever. So we very much also rely on donations. If you can, if you have the means, we're really happy if you provide us with some support for making such events possible. And we're really glad that these events draw a lot of attention. I remember when we had our event on Kurdistan, we had around 500 people listening. So we feel that it does make some sense, and it does draw attention, and it does create some exchange as well in times of Corona and restrictions of movement. So in order to make this in the future as well, we'd be really happy if you supported us a little. That's for me for now. And now I would like to hand over to Lex Takkenberg.
Can you all hear me while I open the presentation? So thank you, Christoph. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you, Orient and Alsharq, for hosting the event and for making all the arrangements. And a big thank you also to all of you who join us today. Very excited about this forum and people who join via Zoom and Facebook live stream. Also very happy to have some dear friends from UNRWA joining us today. So let's get going. For those of you who are new to the question of Palestine, and before in the next two parts of the event we go into a bit more detail. In the next 50 minutes, I will provide a brief overview of the history of the Palestinian refugee question, as well as who the refugees are, where they find themselves, and finally the distinctive regime, different from that of other refugees, that the United Nations created for them. Well, to start with the history, the geographic areas known today as Israel and Palestine were part of the Ottoman Empire from the 14th until the early 20th century, as part of its Arabic province. I was going to use my cursor, but it doesn't work. As part of the Arabic provinces. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, control over the Near East was divided between France, that took responsibility for Syria and Lebanon, and the United Kingdom, and Palestine became an entity slated for self-determination under the British mandate. The mandate under the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations. Now, during this period, the United Kingdom made a number of conflicting promises with respect to the future of Palestine. The most notorious of which, and the precursor to the conflict over Palestine, including the refugee issue, was the Balfour Declaration, named after the then foreign minister, the UK foreign minister, who wrote in November 1917 to the leadership of the Jewish community in the United Kingdom that His Majesty's government was favorably considering the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, however, without jeopardy to the non-Jewish population. Now, this unilateral act by the United Kingdom, without regard to the original population of the land, the Christians and Muslim Palestinians who had lived there, you know, from eternity, that act became the source of conflict that over the subsequent 30 years escalated into full-blown war. Towards the autumn of 1947, the United Kingdom was no longer able to sort of control the mess that it had created, so to speak, and it unilaterally announced that it would withdraw its troops and other presence from Palestine in May of the next year, May 1948. By doing so, the question of Palestine, as it had become known at the time, landed in the lap of the newly established United Nations. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly recommended partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, for the Jewish community in Palestine, it recommended it. It was not, you know, the UN General Assembly had no power to sort of rule how to do this. And here on the map, you see the areas designated by the partition plan in orange for the Palestinian state and in blue for the Jewish state, for the intended Jewish state. So for the Jewish community in Palestine, the partition plan served as the foundation for the proclamation of the State of Israel on 15 May 1948, one day after the last British troops left Palestine. And this in turn triggered armed conflict between Israel and not only the Arab population of Palestine, but also with the neighboring Arab states. Now, during this war, approximately 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, roughly 2/3 of the total population of Palestine, became refugees. And they ended up in the territories and countries around what became Israel, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And that's where the vast majority continue to reside up till the present moment, and I'll come to that in a minute. So who exactly are the Palestinian refugees? There are different definitions, but in general, this is sort of what connects the various definitions that are being used. Palestinian refugees are persons who are displaced outside their homeland, the former British mandate over Palestine until 14 May 1948, as a result of the birth of Israel and the related conflicts between 47 and 49, and then also later conflicts, the Six-Day War, again between Israel and the Arab states, including their descendants. And what characterizes them is that their situation is still to be settled in line with relevant UN resolutions. There has been no political settlement to the underlying conflict. The vast majority of the Palestinian refugees are also stateless persons, stateless in the sense that they lost the citizenship of Palestine that they had until May 1948, without being able to acquire the nationality of any other state. And so they lack national protection by a state. And the only exception of this is the Palestinian refugees in Jordan that have been granted Jordanian citizenship in the early 1950s. As I mentioned already, the majority continue to live in the countries and territories surrounding the State of Israel, the Gaza Strip, West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And these are the countries where UNRWA operates, and we'll come to UNRWA in a minute, with others living in other countries in the Middle East, as well as in 50 countries across the globe. And this displacement of Palestinian refugees has not been limited to the events, to the conflict from 47 to 49, which in Arabic is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. I already mentioned the 1967 war, during which another 350 to 400,000 Palestinians got uprooted, including a significant number of refugees from 48 who got displaced for the second time. And then from 1967 until the present moment, some 250,000 more Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank have been uprooted, sometimes for shorter periods, for longer periods, the Gaza wars, the effects of the barrier, the wall in the West Bank, and so forth, as well as 700,000 Palestinians that have been displaced, or more than 700,000 Palestinians who have been displaced from different Arab countries as a result of renewed conflict in the wider Arab world. So displacement is not only limited to the onset of the conflict, 48, 49, but also very much an ongoing phenomenon that is part of the Palestinian experience, until the very moment, until the present day. And I mentioned already, Palestinian refugees have ended up in 50 plus countries around the world. In the third and fourth chapter of our book of Palestinian Refugees in International Law, we provide a detailed sort of survey of the Palestinians in those various countries around the world. So finally, a few comments about what we refer to as a distinctive regime for Palestinian refugees. There's a lot of confusion as to whether Palestinian refugees are excluded from the international refugees regime, whether there's a protection gap, and what I mean by international refugee regime here is sort of the rules and institutions that are created after the Second World War to deal with refugee situations. Now, as we make clear in our book, Palestinian refugees are not excluded, but the international community put in place for them a distinct regime. Now, the distinct regime is in two parts, partly related to the institutions that provide support to Palestinian refugees, and the other part is sort of with respect to their legal status. Now, you're probably aware that UNHCR is sort of has become over the years the global refugee organization dealing with refugees, irrespective where they find themselves. Now, with respect to Palestinian refugees, at the same time as the UN General Assembly created UNHCR, it created two specific institutions specifically to deal with the question of Palestine and Palestinian refugees. It first created the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine to attempt, with the mandate to attempt a resolution of the conflict, including the refugee issue. And then it created a year later UNRWA as an agency to provide relief to the refugees and to support the UNCCP with the integration of refugees in the economic life of the region. And as I mentioned already, UNRWA operates in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. And in the next part of the presentation, Georg will talk in greater detail about UNRWA. Now, then, in terms of the legal status, in the 1951 Refugee Convention, the main international instrument regulating the status of refugees, it has been it is stipulated that the application of the convention to Palestinian refugees is suspended as long as they are able to enjoy the support by UNRWA, on the understanding that once the support for whatever reason would come to an end, the refugees would fall back, the Palestinian refugees would fall back under the protection of the 1951 Convention. And it made a similar arrangement with respect to UNHCR to avoid overlapping competencies between UNHCR and UNRWA. And so as a result, today we have UNRWA dealing with Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and all other Palestinians in the 45 or so other countries coming under the mandate of UNHCR. In the meantime, the UNCCP, which was created to try to find a resolution to the conflict, including the refugee issue, tried hard for 15 years, and by the middle of the 1960s, concluded that it was, unsuccessful. It had been unsuccessful in its attempts to bring about a peaceful resolution, and it became defunct. So formally still exists, but today there are only UNRWA and UNHCR who sort of, with respect to the respective Palestinians falling under their respective mandates, who are providing support to the Palestinian refugees. On that note, I will end my initial round of comments and give the floor back to Christoph.
Thank you, Lex, for this very much fact-based introduction. I would like to give the floor to Rania right away. If you have comments, if you want to add anything, if you want to disagree, go ahead, please, Rania.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone, and thanks to Orient and Alsharq for organizing this timely event. Thanks also to Lex for giving this historic overview of the Nakba and the situation of Palestinian refugees, the distinctive legal framework that is applicable to them, as well as the ongoing legacy of displacement that you've just described. I think it bears recalling to start with, as Edward Said once said, that facts do not all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them. Such a narrative has to have a beginning and an end. In the Palestinian case, a homeland for the resolution of its exile since 1948. End of quote. For Palestinians, there's a clear continuity between the past and our present realities. This is something that very clearly was shown in Lex's presentation. 72 years on, the Nakba is far from a distant memory for Palestinians. As Lex has just outlined, not only has the ongoing Nakba meant continued denial of the right of return for Palestinian refugees to their original homes, lands, and property, but it has further signified multiple counts of displacement in Palestine and across the region, and the entrenchment of ongoing violations. The legacy of the Nakba, which endures, is even represented in current plans to deepen illegal Israeli annexation and the dispossession of Palestinians, as we've been seeing in the recent months. In addition to looming annexation, as Lex was just saying, Palestinian refugees, in particular in the occupied Palestinian territory, face additional burdens such as overcrowding in densely populated refugee camps. They endure geographic fragmentation in the OPT, a myriad of movement and access restrictions, repeated incursions by the Israeli occupying forces, and an ever-encroaching settlement enterprise in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in addition to 13 years of illegal closure and blockade of Gaza, which amount to unlawful collective punishment. What this means is that without international justice and accountability, Israeli impunity and ongoing rights abuses targeting Palestinians will continue. In addition, there's also an urgent need to ensure and to recenter Palestinian rights and experiences in discussions on Palestine. In doing so, the book Palestinian Refugees and International Law, which Francesca will present in a moment, brings renewed focus to the situation of Palestinian refugees and their inalienable rights, thereby allowing for a shift in how their plight has been addressed to date.
Okay, thank you very much, Rania, for your comments. I wonder if there are any questions by the audience so far. I'm aware that this has been very much a factual presentation, so maybe not that much to discuss, but please feel welcome to send us any sort of question. In the meantime, maybe Rania, you could explain to an audience who has very different like sources of knowledge, and some of us have worked in Palestine, others have never been there. Maybe just explain how, like, after more than 70 years of expulsion and flight, how does refugee life in the occupied Palestinian territories actually look like? Maybe you could describe a little bit how what a refugee camp in Palestine is not only looks like, but what are living conditions and so on, and in how far do they differ to the living conditions of other Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza?
Okay, thanks, Christoph, and maybe some questions will come in the meantime. I think there are two things to be said. The first is that the situation of all Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, but also within the Green Line, is very similar. And Palestinian refugees in refugee camps, they face additional burdens, that some of which I've already mentioned, such as extreme overcrowding, which now, especially with the COVID-19 situation, has particularly rendered them susceptible to the pandemic. But overall, I think what we need to remember is that all Palestinians are facing the same policies of dispossession, land grab, fragmentation, which affects Palestinians in different areas, including Palestinian refugees in exile. And this fragmentation really is the defining marker for the Palestinian experience. In addition, as you know, and as the audience perhaps knows as well, Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory are enduring a 50-year prolonged occupation, 13 years of illegal closure in Gaza, which obviously have significant impacts on everyday life and the very basic rights to which they're entitled. So I think that to really recenter that debate, we have to consider that Palestinian refugees are, of course, part and parcel of the Palestinian people, and their experience is the same one that Palestinians in general are continuing to face on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Rania, for making this also a bit more better able to grasp. We received a first question for Lex.
I saw it. I saw it.
You saw it. Okay. I'll read it out for those who have not seen it. Okay.
Yes.
So Johanna asks, when would you say did the Palestinian national identity develop? You mentioned that they became stateless in 1949. What kind of status did they have before?
This one I didn't see. Yeah, I see a question from Linda.
Yeah, that would have been the second one.
The status of the Palestinians before 48 differed over time. During the Ottoman Empire, they were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, i.e., Ottoman citizens, and for those who were traveling, they could get, travel documentation from the Ottoman authorities. This came to an end with the end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and sort of the rump of it became Turkey, and Palestine became the subject to a League of Nations mandate, which was assigned to the Brits, or rather, the Brits had sort of occupied Palestine, and the mandate, the League of Nations granted sort of a legitimacy over it, so to speak. And as such, they were, the Palestinians were subjects of the British mandate. They were not British nationals per se, but they were subject of the mandate, and thereby enjoying the protection, diplomatic and otherwise, of the mandate authorities, of the British mandate authorities. And in 48, and during the conflict, and as an element, as a key element of the conflict, those Palestinians, the 750,000 that became refugees, that fled the territory that became Israel, no longer had this British mandate citizenship, or this Palestine mandate citizenship. And contrary to the Palestinians who stayed behind, who Israel granted Israeli citizenship, those who fled not only were not allowed to return, even in spite of very compelling calls by the UN General Assembly that the refugees be allowed to return, and that is what is very central to the Palestinian, and Rania already mentioned it. You know, this right of return that has become very central to the Palestinian narrative. So the Palestinians who fled not only were prevented from returning, but as a result, they also, you know, did not qualify for Israeli citizenship, and then the Arab state that the UN General Assembly in the partition plan had called for never materialized. So as a result, the Palestinians in the diaspora have been stateless, with again the only exception, Palestinians in Jordan. And then there are individual Palestinians who obtain citizenship of Germany, of some small minorities in Lebanon, and of, you know, a range of other Western countries and other countries, you know, on a case-by-case basis. But the vast majority of Palestinian refugees are also stateless persons, and they constitute the largest stateless population in the world. Then I see, you have to tell me, Christoph, if there's no longer time, but I see a question whether I can briefly summarize the Oslo Accords of 1993 and why the peace plan wasn't successful. Well, the Oslo Accords were a breakthrough between the PLO and Israel, whereby the two parties agreed to the establishment of limited self-rule for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and large parts of the West Bank. Self-rule, it's not the same as sort of statehood. And one of the big shortcomings of the Oslo Accord, and probably also the reason that, you know, it ultimately failed to bring a lasting peace, was the fact that, you know, the Oslo agreements, the Declaration of Principle, and then the subsequent treaties that were concluded between the PLO and Israel, you know, did not mention as the outcome of this self-rule the creation of a Palestinian state. It was essentially left open what would happen, you know, after this self-rule period. And that is, as I said, you know, the main shortcoming of the process. Now, what Oslo did was effectively made the situation much worse, because it created a territorial partition of the Gaza, separation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Not only a geographical separation, but you know, political separation, and a fragmentation of the West Bank in 3 different areas, so-called Areas A, where the Palestinians were getting full control, full sort of administrative control. Areas B, where there was Palestinian civil administration and Israeli security, control, and Area C, where essentially Israel maintained the full control and where the vast majority of the settlements were located. So as a result of the failed Oslo process, we today have a hugely fragmented West Bank, whereby, and the West Bank, one of the things we should recall is that, the UN General Assembly in 1947 tried to partition Palestine in roughly sort of equal states, which in itself was problematic because the Palestinian, the Arab population of Palestine was much larger than the Jewish population at the time. But in the 47, 48, 49 war, Israel occupied 78% of historic Palestine, with the Palestinians left with 22% in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And of this 22%, more than half is currently, as a result of Oslo, unavailable to Palestinians, as it is categorized as Area C in the West Bank, and thereby, limiting the space, the remaining space available to Palestinians to less than sort of 10% of historic Palestine.
Okay, Lex, we have kind of reached our time limit, but let's take another 2 questions, okay? And those who have posed questions, I will not forget them, and maybe I will be able to post them to other speakers later on who are also extremely knowledgeable. So let's come to one question that asks about the legal and socio-economic situations of Palestinian refugees in the neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, or Jordan. How do they differ from your experience? And another question, which might be a bit, you just answered in the way you like to answer it, by Konrad. Since Palestine is not a state, is it correct to say that all Palestinians are stateless? Let's finish with these 2 questions for the moment, and we won't forget the other 5, 6, 7 questions that have reached us in the meantime.
Yeah, very quickly on the legal and socioeconomic situation of Palestinian refugees in the neighboring host countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. I mentioned already that Jordan, for political reasons, for certain historic political reasons, has granted citizenship to the Palestinian refugees, and thereby sort of gave, extended national protection to them. And that has allowed the very sizable Palestinian presence in Jordan to be economically successful, fully integrated, and contribute to the overall economic and socioeconomic development of the country. So a very good situation in Jordan, relatively speaking. In Syria, similarly, before the civil war, Syria had not granted citizenship, but had by law stipulated that Palestinian refugees were to be treated on equal par to Syrian nationals, which had also resulted in a very broad economic integration of refugees, of Palestinian refugees, in the economy of Syria, and opening up of education and employment to Palestinian refugees in Syria. Of course, this has dramatically deteriorated, not just for the Palestinian refugees, but also for Syrians, with the onset of the conflict in 2011. By contrast, in Lebanon, the situation has from the very beginning been very problematic for Palestinian refugees. In Lebanon, after the French Mandate period, there had become, a political constitutional arrangement with a very delicate balance between the different Christian and Muslim groups. And by vast majority, Muslim Palestinian refugees were sort of seen as a threat to that delicate religious balance. And as a result, the handful of Christians among the refugees were almost immediately given Lebanese citizenship, and the Muslims among them were, barely tolerated and given a very substandard situation, as a result of which the socioeconomic situation of Palestinian refugees is by far the worst among those three countries. Then on statelessness and the relationship with sort of the evolving Palestinian statehood, I mean, we are aware that there has been a movement and a development over the past couple of decades towards increasing recognition of what the UN has now, acknowledged to be the state of Palestine. And so there is, in a way, a political entity that constitutes the state of Palestine. But this entity, as a result of the all-encompassing occupation, is not able to be truly sovereign and independent, and therefore not able to extend protection to the Palestinian refugees living in Gaza and the West Bank, let alone Palestinian refugees outside in the diaspora. So effectively, by applying the test of sort of effective protection, the Palestinian refugees continue to be stateless persons who are not being able to enjoy the protection of a national state. Now, this is a very simplistic sort of elaboration. In our book. We elaborate on this in far greater detail.
Thank you so much, Lex.